All right, so uh, today we're going to take a deep dive into some really fascinating territory. A
Yes.
lot of listeners wanted to get a better grasp on the potential impact of Trump's second term. And
Yeah.
there was so much talk back then about chaos and this lack of guardrails,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But get this, the source material that you sent over paints a much more complex picture.
It does. There was a lot of anxiety around the idea of a second Trump term. Many people were very concerned about the potential for instability and really unchecked executive power.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I shared some of those concerns too.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The source material suggests that even with Trump's personal stances, certain areas actually saw some surprising progress during his first term.
Yeah.
It's almost like things weren't as black and white as so many folks predicted.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that, societal progress rarely follows a straight line. There are often unexpected twists and turns, and sometimes even under administrations that seem opposed to certain types of change, we actually see advancements in those very areas.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what are some examples of this unexpected progress?
Okay.
The source material mentions social movements like #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, and LGBTQ plus visibility as areas that saw advancements despite Trump's often vocal opposition.
That's right. Take the #MeToo movement, for example.
Okay.
Even though Trump himself faced numerous allegations of sexual misconduct, the movement gained significant momentum during his presidency. E. Jean Carroll even won her sexual assault lawsuit against him in 2019.
Wow, I had almost forgotten about that. It's
Yeah.
almost like the pushback from figures like Trump fueled the fire of these movements, wouldn't you say?
It's certainly possible. The concept of backlash suggests that opposition itself can be an indicator of change happening. When progress threatens existing power structures or social norms, it often triggers a reaction from those who feel threatened by it.
Right.
And that reaction can sometimes energize the very movements it seeks to suppress.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about who's at the top, but also about these larger cultural currents that are always in motion, right?
Exactly. And we see evidence of this in other areas as well. For instance, Merriam-Webster chose they as their word of the year in 2019, reflecting a growing acceptance of gender fluidity. And many companies felt pressure to implement diversity and inclusion programs driven by both internal advocacy and external pressure. All of this happened during Trump's first term.
So it's like there's this undercurrent of change happening, regardless of what was coming from the administration.
Precisely. It highlights the power of grassroots movements and cultural shifts that can sometimes operate independently of or even in contrast to the political landscape.
That's a pretty hopeful thought, actually.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move on to another topic that might surprise you.
Okay.
Climate change. We all know Trump wasn't exactly known for being an environmental champion, right?
Right. His stance on climate change was well documented. He often expressed skepticism about the science, withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Agreement, and rolled back environmental regulations.
Yeah.
He was a vocal supporter of the fossil fuel industry.
Exactly. But then we come across some pretty unexpected data. The source material mentions that coal consumption actually decreased during his presidency, while renewable energy sources saw a surge in growth. And get this, hybrid and electric car sales tripled during his first term.
Wow.
It's a real head-scratcher, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do we reconcile those seemingly contradictory facts?
This is a classic example of where market forces and technological advancements can drive change, even without explicit presidential support. The demand for cleaner energy and more fuel-efficient vehicles was already growing, driven by factors like concerns about climate change advancements in renewable energy technology and consumer preferences.
So even though Trump's policies weren't exactly aligned with those trends, the momentum for change was already building and it just kept rolling.
Exactly. Sometimes the tide turns not because of a single leader's agenda, but because of larger societal and economic forces at play.
So in this case, the market and technology were driving forces, even if the political landscape wasn't exactly on board.
Okay, I want to switch gears now and talk about something that really surprised me in the source material we're talking about, the economic landscape and the unexpected shift in Black and Latino voters towards Trump.
Okay.
You probably remember all the chatter trying to explain this phenomenon after the election.
Yes, it was a significant shift. There were many attempts to understand what drove it, with some attributing it to sexism, while others pointed to improved economic conditions under Trump's first term.
Right. I remember there were even some folks who thought Obama's comment about some Black men perhaps not being comfortable with a woman as president might have played a role.
Right.
Do you think there's any validity to that idea? It's certainly possible that gender dynamics played a role for some voters, but I think it's important to avoid oversimplifications. Voter behavior is rarely driven by one factor alone. It's a complex interplay of personal beliefs, economic realities, cultural identity, and a host of other factors.
You're right, it's never that simple, is it?
It's really not.
But speaking of economic realities, the source material did point out some positive economic trends for Black and Latino families during Trump's first term. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Absolutely. Before the pandemic hit, homeownership rates for Black and Latino families were on the rise, and unemployment rates for these groups were at historic lows.
So there were some tangible economic gains for these communities, which might have influenced their voting decisions.
It's certainly a plausible explanation. Economic anxiety, or conversely, a sense of economic well-being, can be a powerful motivator for voters.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got social progress defying expectations, market forces driving change on climate even without presidential support, and even the housing market proving to be more resilient than anticipated. It seems like this idea of no guardrails during Trump's first term might need some further examination.
I think you're onto something. If those guardrails were truly absent, wouldn't we have seen far more detrimental outcomes in these areas?
Exactly. It seems like there's more to the story than just unchecked executive power. There must have been other factors at play that mitigated some of the potential damage.
Absolutely, and the source material you provided offers some compelling counterarguments to that notion of unchecked power. For example, deportations actually decreased under Trump compared to Obama's presidency.
You're kidding. I never would have guessed that. And what about the impact of the Dobbs decision? Many feared it would lead to a nationwide ban on abortion, but the source material points out that voters in multiple states took action to restore access.
That's right. It suggests that the real guardrails might not reside within the administration itself, but rather in the form of social movements, legal challenges, and public pressure exerted by citizens.
So it's less about a single person or administration wielding all the power, and more about this ongoing push and pull between that power and the collective will of the people.
That's a very insightful observation, and it's a dynamic that's constantly at play in any democracy. The balance of power is always shifting, and citizens have a crucial role to play in holding their leaders accountable and shaping the direction of their society.
Wow, this is all really fascinating. It seems like reality has a way of defying predictions, especially when it comes to politics.
Indeed, it's a reminder that societal progress is rarely linear or predictable. It's a messy, complex, and often surprising process.
Well, this deep dive has certainly been full of surprises, and it's given me a lot to think about.
It seems like we keep coming back to this idea that things aren't always as they appear, especially in the world of politics. We often have these preconceived notions or predictions, and then reality throws us a curveball.
You're absolutely right, and I think that's one of the biggest takeaways for me from this deep dive so far. It's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom, especially when the political climate feels so intense. But what we've seen in these sources is that progress can happen in the most unexpected ways.
I think that's a crucial point. Even when things seem bleak or uncertain, there are always avenues for change, whether it's through grassroots movements, legal challenges, or shifts in cultural norms. Progress can unfold in ways we might not anticipate.
It's like instead of fixating on who's in power at the top, we should also be paying attention to those forces at play beneath the surface, the undercurrents, as you might call them.
That's a great analogy. Those undercurrents are often what drive lasting change. Think about the movements we've discussed. #MeToo Black Lives Matter. The fight for LGBTQ+ rights. These didn't gain momentum because of a particular politician's agenda. They emerged from the collective experiences and demands of people who were tired of the status quo.
And they harnessed the power of their voices, organized and pushed for change even when it felt like an uphill battle. It's actually quite inspiring when you think about it.
It is, and it reminds us that political power isn't solely concentrated in the hands of elected officials. We the people have power too. The power to speak out, to organize, to hold our leaders accountable, and to demand a better future.
So even if we don't agree with everything happening at the top, we're not powerless to affect change.
Precisely, and I think that's a message we need to hear, especially in times when it's easy to feel overwhelmed or disillusioned by the political landscape. Recognizing our own agency, our own ability to make a difference, that's where real hope lies.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep pushing for a better future.